All right, everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are doing GLCC Season 1 Power Rankings with all 14 teams lined up here, and we're going to just rank them. Me and co-host Smaster, that is, we're just going to rank them in what, in our opinion, is from the weakest team all the way up to the number one strongest team, just based on the drafts. Of course, this doesn't take into account anything like, how good or bad each coach is at Pokemon, how much experience they have. We're just simply looking at the teams in a very objective manner and basing them off of some criteria that we had thought of, such as hazard setters and controls, speed tiers, defensive options, and you name it. So, but yeah, without any further ado, I will allow co-host S Master to introduce himself. How are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing good. Thank you for having me on your channel. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, of course. And of course, this is also going to be pretty like inaccurate, I bet, after a while. Lord knows that's how power rankings like tend to age, but we're going to just try and do our best, and we'll get straight into it. Starting off the bottom of the list, unfortunately, someone had to go here, number 14, and it's going to be the Korok Space program, coached by Curb with Mono Grass. There is a lot of usability on this team, of course. You have strong Mons like Ogerpon Fire, Hisui and Lilligant. Who knows, maybe Hydrapple's going to turn out really nice. But there are some key issues as well. And as much as I appreciate round one, dual stabs, Terra, Jump Luff, I don't think it's going to save the team, unfortunately. First of all, there's no Rillaboom or Thwackey, which is definitely interesting considering that it's a automatic grassy terrain setter. And so you don't have any of that powerful grassy glide priority capability, really, unless you're going to manually set terrain, which is not very good. Another thing was that there's a lot of duplicate speed tiers. Like, for instance, we have tons and tons of clump speed tiers around like 100 to 110, right around in that range. And I mean, that's not necessarily the worst speed tier to have a big clump in, but of course it's not necessarily a great thing. Additionally, the removal on this team is Defog on Hisui and Lilligant and Hisui and Decidueye, which, when you're considering the fact that Firepon cannot hold boots because it's locked into holding the mask as its item, and every time it switches in, if there's stealth rocks up, it's going to take that fat 25%. It's really not good, and so you've got to be able to get rid of those rocks any way you can. And unfortunately, I don't think that the Korok Space program has the best tools to really go about doing that. And so, yeah, unfortunately, someone had to go into the 14 spot. It's going to be this mono grass team with a fair bit of type redundancy as well. Of course, it is monotype, so everything's going to be grass. But, like, again, Lilligant Hisui and Decidueye Hisui doubling up on that fighting type. And also, there's no spores, I'm pretty sure, which is pretty interesting. I know that there's some sleep powder mons, so maybe that'll be the alternative, but just something else that I noticed. But yeah, somebody had to take the last spot. Unfortunately, it's going to be Curb and the Korok Space program, and I will hand it over to S Master to talk about our number 13 pick.
Yep, so for number 13, unfortunately we had to put Mountain Man here with his Cerulean Edge team that is mono poison. And really the main weaknesses of this team that we identified was just not having a lot of offensive pieces. Generally, as a type, poison is very defensive, but this draft is really missing a lot of the really strong offensive pieces that poison does have access to, such as Iron Moth. And things like that, which were all kind of sniped away by the other players in this draft. So that kind of accounts for why there aren't as many offensive options. But just losing that much offense and having strong defensive Pokemon, right? We have Clodsire, Tentacruel, Fez, Alolan Muck, all very good Pokemon, but just not having a lot of offense makes it hard to break and win games, even though you might be able to last longer. It's just hard to really end up winning at the end. There are also some clustered speed tiers. We noticed that there are some weaknesses to its types that it's weak to. So like poison, there's only one psychic neutrality and only a couple ground neutralities, which ideally you want a little bit more to threaten those types that really hurt you, because every team will probably have at least one Pokemon that either has coverage or is one of those dual types, and so you want to be able to try and cover your weaknesses with at least 1 or 2 Mons. And it's also just missing a offensive core and synergy pieces. A lot of the Mons kind of just look like they're all doing the same kind of role, and so because of that, we ended up having to put Cerulean Edge and Mountain Man at 13. But yeah, there's just a lack of synergy in general, and the best Mons in like Sneasel and Grafai for offense, they also just don't have terrain support, which is a big part of their offense with their Unburden ability. So just not having as much synergy on the team. Although there is good hazard control, which is a good plus, not having that offense to really close out games is really what hurts it. But yeah, I'll turn it over to Central for the number 12 spot.
All right, sounds good. Thank you for that. At number 12, we have the Area Zero Archers, which is coached by Arch. And this is a mono bug team. So, I mean, immediately off rip, the typing is one that's generally not very attractive for monotype. I'd say certainly not very attractive for monotype bug, or rather monotype draft. But, I respect the hustle. I respect the hustle, and there's a lot of positives, I think, on this team as well. So we'll go through some of those first. First of all, sticky webs galore. Great, considering the fact that some of the bugs are not very fast. It's really good to have that nice web support. In addition to webs, there's also lots of hazard support in Cleavor, Terra, Vespiquen, and so there's definitely a lot of potential to hazard stack. That being said, the team overall does not also deal with hazards too well on its own. I think that the only removals on this team are Scizor and Cleavor with Defog, and both of them don't really want to run that because they'd rather run offensive sets and actually do some damage. In addition, this team is pretty slow. The fastest Pokemon is base 100, and fortunately it does have webs to mitigate that, but if you run into a team that has good removal and can keep those webs off the field, eliminate the sticky web Pokemon maybe before it can get them up and have them last, it's going to be pretty rough with base 100 as your fastest Pokemon. Obviously there's going to be some good Scarfers in Cleavor. I know runs a lot of Scarf, things like that, but that's something that you're going to have to compensate for, and then you're weak to Stealth Rocks because you're a bug type, yada yada yada. Additionally, because it's a bug type, I think something else that's lacking is a really powerful defensive core, right? Obviously, you have some bulky assets like Araquanid is surprisingly bulky, especially on that special side, for instance, but overall there's no real backbone, and so you're going to be relying on almost hyper offensive sort of play style with lots of momentum moves and U-turn and then first impression spam to really get by probably in most weeks. And of course I don't want to rip on the bug type too much, but the only real top tier threat on this team is going to be that Volcarona, if you do consider it a top tier threat in draft. It was the most expensive Pokemon on this team at only 15 points, so definitely not exactly what you want to have as your main breaker setup-y sweeper mon as Volcarona, and then that's kind of it. But when you're a bug team, your options are kind of limited, I guess. But then again, I do respect the hustle, and we'll throw it back to S-Master for number 11.
Yeah, so at number 11, we have Hail Hydra, the fighting team, drafted by Not Kai. And this team, generally looking at it, right, you just see an onslaught of very strong physical attackers, which is good in some instances, but also not having many special options can be a bit of a drawback in that it's not really needed to prepare for those special threats. You can kind of just get away with running a bunch of PhysDev Pokemon and probably walling out a lot of the threats. That being said, they are very strong Pokemon, a lot of very good breakers. So potentially you could try and muscle past those checks, especially for some of the types that don't have great physical checks, but it is something to keep in mind. And another thing that we noticed, there is good removal in Great Tusk, which is probably the best remover in the game, as well as Conk can be removal, although it really doesn't want to be sitting around defogging. It does have that option. We did notice that there's only one hazard setter in Tusk, which gets rocks, but no spikes, which is something that this fighting team would really benefit from to help wear down those physical checks. And also there's not as much coverage for its weaknesses, in that it has a couple fairy neutralities, but only one psychic immunity, and it's the Terra Captain Scrafty, which probably doesn't want to bring some weeks, just due to it being so slow, and has no real checks to flying. Besides, like, the Iron Hands is the one neutrality, but against six flying types, as you'd see in mono type, one Iron Hands might not be enough to really go all the way there. Also, only having one Terra Cap was one drawback that we saw. It kind of limits your options, and your opponent can prep very easily for the Terra, which is kind of unfortunate in a metagame that is really defined by this mechanic. And once again, another drawback of being a full physical team, burns really hurt. You do have a couple options in, like, Embor being immune to burns and Scrafty having shed skin. Conk gets guts, so does Heracross, things like that. So you can kind of work around it, but you're going to have to do a lot of prep, and making sure that you don't let your crucial mons get burned or worn down by things like rocky helmets. So running protective pads might be necessary, which does hurt in that you don't get to run boosting items or other kinds of, like, utility items. So overall, it's a very strong team, and I would say all the teams are very strong, but it does have some significant weaknesses, which is why we put it at this number 11. So yeah, moving on to number 10.
All right, and at number 10, speaking of strong teams, unfortunately just not quite strong enough to make it much higher on the list, we have the Twin Leaf Town Turtwigs, coached by my boy Lost Lottle, and this is a mono psychic team. Right out of the chute, you look at the top and the bottom of the draft, and you see some really nice threats. Jirachi, Iron Boulder, Latias, right? And then some really good Terra captains with outstanding Terra types in Delphox and Espeon. And so on paper, really strong offensively already. Also Indeedee there with Psychic Terrain. This is a key difference, I think, in between this team and the mono grass team before, without Rillaboom or Thwacky to set up grassy terrain, is that we have Psychic Terrain here for the Psychic team, and it's going to help out immensely, stopping things like Shadow Sneaks and Sucker Punches, and just allowing Expanding Force to be run on things over Psychic just to do more damage. You love to see the Psychic Terrain support from this Indeedee. Now, onto some things that I think could be a little bit better. First of all, this team doesn't have a super duper strong defensive backbone to fall on again, and that's something that we've harped on for a couple of these teams already. But if you look across the board, the only dedicated defensive piece is really that Glow King, oftentimes, as the premier special defense wall on a team. And so if that's your only defensive mon, then you're kind of forced more often than you'd like to run things like Jirachi and Necro as a more defensive role rather than as a offensive setup sort of role in the case of Necrozma, or as a Ironhead flinch bot in the case of Jirachi. You're going to be forced to use those guys as more defensive roles. In addition, again, it's another team that unfortunately doesn't get spikes. I'm guilty of this myself, as we'll talk about a little bit later, but having only rocks sort of does limit the capabilities for the powerful offensive lineup that I discussed earlier in breaking down teams and claiming those kills. There's also not too many options to really cover up its weaknesses in Ghost and Dark. Obviously, you have some normal types in Weirdeer, Indeedee, not the best options in order for patching up its weaknesses. Then again, team is still pretty outstanding, I think. Just has some flaws that unfortunately put it a little bit too far down on the list. I will move up to number 9.
Yeah, for number 9, so we have Sapporo Snowverse, which is our mono fairy team, and this is drafted by Exilus. And the reason why we put this team at number 9 is because it does actually have good hazard control for monotype. Right, the challenge with monotype is that in already limited decks with very few hazard removers, getting hazard control is at a premium, and if you restrict it to one type, there are often not many hazard removers for each type, but Hatterene and Wheezing Glare are definitely very, very good hazard control. Hatterene has the added advantage of potentially even setting your own hazards by reflecting your opponent's back at them, which is really nice, and they both also make a very good defensive backbone. We also know that in monotype, it's really important to be able to cover your weaknesses, and this team does do that very well. It does cover the steel and the poison weakness well. It has good neutralities, good immunities, has good threats that can take those types of mons on and break them down, which will really be helpful for the rest of the team. Overall, it is a very solid team, but there are some general weaknesses that we noticed that really brought it to this spot on the list, around the mid-tier area. And one of those things is just the fact that there's not that much offensive pressure on this team. As a mono fairy team, that is a danger in that a lot of fairies are more defensively inclined, but having Iron Valiant and Amorous and Azumarill are all definitely very, very strong and good offensive options. But in a lot of matchups, Azumarill is not really going to want to be offensive. It's going to want to be more defensive, considering it's the only bulky water on this team. And a lot of its other offensive options like Clefable, Mimikyu, Tinkaton, they're all like pretty weak on a raw basis, like as breakers, and they really need that setup opportunity and some time to really get going, which does hurt the team a little bit. Whimsicott also is a good mon, but it feels a bit out of place on this team, and that it doesn't have any hazard abusers of its priority weather that it can provide, or it's different support like Tailwind and things like that. So it's going to be a more of an offensive mon, which is not the greatest utility of that mon, especially since it's a pretty expensive mon at 11 points. Additionally, the Terra Captains are very mediocre. In general, Fairy does not have too many lower tier mons, so this makes sense, but it is still a consideration that Mimikyu and Granbull, while they are decent mons, there are definitely much better Terra Captains on a lot of the other teams, which does knock this team a couple points. Additionally, since Wheezing often runs Levitate in order to get rid of its ground weakness, there isn't really a grounded poison unless you are going to run that grounded Wheezing and potentially have a worse Pokemon just to prevent toxic spikes, which is not ideal, but it is an option, so it is a little bit better than some of the other teams that don't have that grounded poison. Overall, it is a pretty strong team, very solid, but it does lack some offensive pressure, and the defensive pieces, they do lack some recovery, and so will often get worn down easily and overrun. But if piloted well, I think it is a pretty strong team. So yeah, with that, we'll move on to number 8.
Alrighty, and at number 8, we actually initially had this team much lower, but the more and more we looked at it, the more and more this draft impresses us. We have the Vegas Golden Gallades, coached by Dracogon. This team is going to be mono fire type. The thing that sticks out to me immediately is as a fire team, you've got to have some hazard control, right? And then you look at the roster, there's Defog on Talonflame, Rapid Spin on Torkoal, Court Change on Cinderace. There's all sorts of different options here for removal, and the fire type team is really going to appreciate that. So hats off to Dracogon for taking that into account and picking good options here. In addition to hazard removal, this team also has some pretty good hazard stacking options, plus it has a ghost type in Skeledirge, which is bulky, and a very as a result, it's a very good spin blocker. In addition, there are some nice answers to its weaknesses. Obviously, for water, you have Terra Zard and Volcanion with that water absorb. And in addition, you have both Flyers and Rotom with Levitate for ground, and Rock went undrafted. So that's really beneficial for the Fire team here as well. In addition, there's a great selection of both physical and special breakers with very spread speed tiers. You love to see that. There's even some good priority in Hisui and Arcanine, and a nice defensive backbone, all things considered. And, of course, the Sun support. Now, the things that do sort of stick out to us was that there's only, again, one Terra Captain, and it's really not that good of one. I mean, it's Charizard. I guess it's Game Freak's child. It might have some plot armor. But at the end of the day, it's really not the best. And since there's only one of them, this team's Terra options are going to be very, very predictable. Like, either ground works or either grass works. So it's going to be very, very predictable if you're prepping against this team as to what this Zard is probably going to Terra into. In addition, while there is some good synergy, there are also, I think this team is going to struggle sometimes to like pick 6 Mons for battles, right? Because if you look across the board, we said that we had good physical and special breakers. We also had good answers to weaknesses. We also had good pivots. We also had good hazard setters. We also had good removers. But unfortunately, a lot of those roles are spread out like really thinly across the entire roster. And so maybe in some matchups you have to not bring your hazard setters, like your primary hazard setters. Or maybe you sacrifice one of those offensive Mons in order to have a more established defensive backbone. And so I think that that is something for the Vegas Golden Gallades to consider when they're team building. In addition, even though the whole team, of course, has strong Fire Stab, the team doesn't fully abuse Sun, and that's partially because Gouging Fire was sniped. But the only two like real Sun abusers are Scovillain and Terra Charizard, which again, sort of mid, you know. But of course, with everything getting fire coverage anyways, or not fire coverage, fire stab anyways, then maybe Sun is still going to pull its weight. Of course, only time will tell. Really, really excited to see this team in action. I think it's really, really good given the nature of the fire type. So congratulations to Dracagon for drafting a good fire team. And we're going to move on to number 7.
Awesome. So number 7, we're now in the top half of the list of power rankings because we have 14 coaches and we're on the top 7 right now. And at number 7, we're going to have the Miami Heatrans, the mono flying team that is actually coached by me. And looking at the team itself, there is in general great type diversity with lots of coverage. There's not really any kind of type duplication, which is definitely a big plus. And there's also very good hazard setters in Gligar and Masquerain with webs, which really heavily supports the team considering it is a bit slow. There aren't that many fast Mons. It is also nice just in general as a flying type team to be immune to most hazards, and you automatically get very good removal in Corviknight and Noivern both having Defog, as well as Drifbloom also has Defog as well. There's also really good momentum because a lot of these Mons get U-turn, Landorus, Zapdos, Noivern, etc. The speed tiers are all covered, which is nice. And there are several ways to stop ice types, which is the main team that this team is going to struggle with, just because Rock and Electric both went undrafted, which is really nice for it. And those options are pretty versatile, and you have both offensive options in Zapdos, as well as some defensive options in Corviknight, as well as the Terra captains of Articuno and Gligar can both Terra into types that help out with that. We also have solid physical and special pressure. In terms of offense, you have very strong physical attackers in Zapdos, Gyarados, and Mons like that, but you also have very strong special breakers in Moltres and Landorus, while you also have some very good Terra captains as well to really put pressure on the opponent. Unfortunately, the defensive pieces are a bit sketchy. You really only have Corviknight and Gligar, and you don't really have any dedicated special walls. So a lot of times you're going to be relegated to running more defensive sets on mons like Gyarados and Noivern, which might be a little bit problematic when you really need those speed tiers in the case of Noivern, or you really need, Gyarados' offensive presence, being able to, Dragon Dance and use its strong coverage to really pressure a team. So that is one thing to look out for. Another big issue is that it really relies heavily on webs because it's very slow, and webs plus defog is not always a good combination, because a lot of times you're going to be defogging away your web setter. You're going to be defogging away your webs, and your web setter is Masquerain, which is not exactly the bulkiest mon. And you do have good speed control in Prankster Thunderwave with Thundy, as well as some Tailwind users, because flying types, they all pretty much get Tailwind. But it is important to keep in mind that defogging will remove your main really win condition in webs, which is definitely pretty tough. But overall, it's a good team. Has some core weaknesses, which is why it fell to number 7, but very strong team nonetheless. And with that, we're going to move on to number 6.
Alrighty, and number 6 is going to be the New Jersey Nets, coached by Gradients, and this team is Monotype Ground. Being Monotype Ground, of course, it has outstanding hazard stacking capabilities, as well as solid removal in both Terra Sandslash and Excadrill. This team puts on a lot of defensive pressure with a very, very solid backbone and a lot of bulky offense as a result, both physically and specially. And yeah, there's a lot going on for this team in regards for both offense and defense. It has pretty nice counterplay to water and decent-ish counterplay to grass. It relies a lot on its Terra Caps for that one, and it's going to have a little bit of trouble with its ice weakness. But again, very, very nicely built defensive and offensive team with some really good setup sweepers, decent, solid breakers overall. So you love to see it from this ground team. We will say that something that we noticed was that overall the team is very, very slow. The fastest mon naturally is going to be that Garchomp, and so you're not going to have that elite speed tier unless, of course, Sand Rush activates on Excadrill, which is probably pretty realistic in most matchups, considering you have Hippowdon here for some automatic sand setting, and Excadrill is most likely going to be brought to a lot of matchups. So I guess that is one way for this team to achieve speed, but that's also kind of the only real way for this team to achieve speed, other than like rapid spinning once on Sandslash or something like that. So a little bit slow, but offensively and defensively really, really well built. Great Terra Captains in Sandslash, and that Palossand is a nice defensive piece, and a spin blocker before it Terras, which is cool. And yeah, some decent counterplay to its weaknesses. Love to see it. Pretty solid team. And we will move on to number 5.
Yes, and number 5, we actually have our Seattle Slashers, which is the Mono Dragon team coached by Central. And this team, as a Mono Dragon team, is quite strong. A lot of the mons themselves are just very strong in general, but also Central drafted a very strong team that covers its type weaknesses very well with its neutralities. Really, you have to watch out for both Fairy and Ice, which both were drafted in this season. Although Steel, which is one of Dragon's resists, did not get drafted, which is very helpful. And those weaknesses are very well covered. Gouging Fire, Dragouge, Appletun for Ice, Archaludon. Very, very consistent and strong answers to both of those types. And you have a great way to really pressure them with all the other mons that might not be resistances, but still have offensive coverage in order to really take those mons down. You also have a very good defensive backbone. I mean, a lot of these mons are offensive, but can also double in defensive roles just on virtue of having such really strong stats. This includes Archaludon, which is an insane defensive stat with stamina to boost it even further. You have Raging Bolt, which is just a bulky mon in general that also hits really hard, has good priority. And then you have Gouging Fire, which can be defensive if it needs to be, with that Burning Bulwark signature move, as well as just solid defenses and great typing. And Dragouge in general is a very, very strong, specially defensive Pokemon. It also hits back very hard, even uninvested, which makes it very easy to really try to lean more into the defensive aspect of it if it's needed in the current matchup. It also has very, very strong breakers, Lati, Dragouge, and, Gouging Fire. If it gets up a Dragon Dance or two, even without Sun support, they're all very, very strong mons, hit really hard, can really work on breaking down their checks. And, what are you going to switch into consistent Dracos over and over again, right? It's really hard to find very, very consistent answers to all this overwhelming offense that's going on here. You also have really good endgame cleaners in Moon and Flygon and Raging Bolt with that priority signature move Thunderclap, which helps you really close out games after your breakers have really come in and wreaked havoc all over the other team. And you do really have a lot of really strong special attackers that can drop Draco, which is, Dragon type signature move, that 130 base power, really strong nuke. However, this does lead to a little bit of a reliance on that special offense. You do only have two really strong physical attackers in Roaring Moon and Gouging Fire. So that is something to keep in mind, that it really does lack a little bit of that physical offense, but Draco is such a strong move that it probably won't be too big of a noticeable weakness. And also you have less mons in general, just because dragon types are generally very expensive. They're tiered very heavily. We did that in an effort to balance the type a lot more compared to the other types that don't have as many strong options. And so because of that, less mons equals less flexibility, which does equal a little bit more predictability. But, there's some overwhelming offense here that even if it is a little bit more predictable, it's still very hard to really check. You also do lack a couple of hazard setters, which would be nice to have, a spiker to really help those breakers work really well and wear down their checks even further. But Flygon does provide rocks, and so does Arcaludon. So there are some, at least, rockers, and Dragouge can run T-Spikes as well pretty consistently. Overall, it's a very strong team. Speed tiers are also elite and has good priority and pivoting options, and just generally very, very strong mons that all have very good roles for the team. So that's why it made it into the top 5, and it is our current number 5 team.
All right, and just outside of the podium, we have number 4 with the New York Raging Bulls. Wow, really, really good team. Mono Ice, coached by Sir Blue. Outstanding. First of all, speed tiers. Super duper duper oppressive speed tiers. Lots and lots of fast mons with outstanding priority options. In addition, there's also a Frostlass here, which is a spiker, and it even spin blocks for itself. And so there's just a lot going on for this team. In addition, of course, we have both Aurora Veil setters in Abomasnow and, of course, Alolan Ninetales, the preferred one, most likely. And it has a lot of setup sweepers that are going to benefit greatly from having that Veil in front of them. You've got DD Bax, you've got Mamo with Trailblaze, you've got Weavile with Swords Dance, so much more. It's really going to be putting on a lot of pressure offensively, as the Ice type tends to do, better than defensively at least. And it's going to create some very fast-paced games, most likely, that a lot of other teams are, frankly, just not built for. And so this team is going to be very, very excellent, I think, at out-offensing its opponents and just breaking down any defensive cores that will struggle, really, to take repeated setup Bax hits, setup Weavile hits, as well as Iron Bundle. So there's a lot going on here. We did notice that when Veil is not up and when Snow is not up, then this team is probably going to struggle a fair bit, because a lot of these mons are quite frail, and defensively the Ice type is certainly not the best. In addition, it's also a hazard weak type, being weak to that rock type, and there's no grounded poison to get rid of those T-Spikes. The only removal other than that is going to be Hisui and Avalugg, the Terra Captain, which is not the best considering it dies to like one special hit. And it will probably also, as you're trying to spin, be giving up a lot of that fast-paced momentum that this team really wants to hold. And so, you kind of hate to see that it's going to be a rock weak team. But of course, if it can grab an early lead and just sort of slam dunk the battle on the opposition in a very quick fashion, then maybe it doesn't need to switch too much, and maybe just one or two pairs of boots is going to be enough in order to secure this team a win in a lot of scenarios. But yeah, really, really good team when Snow and Veil are up. Tons and tons of beneficiaries of both Snow and Veil. There's also that Terra Bear Tick, can't sleep on that, with Slush Rush to make it super duper fast. And yeah, there's tons and tons of great offensive options on this team. Really, really fun, hyper offensive sort of team, coming in at number 4 here. We'll move on up to number 3.
Yeah, so now we're in the top 3 best teams that we have in our league this season. And just to reiterate, these are just the teams that we're judging strictly based on the mons that were drafted and how the team looks in general. Obviously, this is not any kind of prediction or any kind of relation to how the actual season will go and how the coaches will be able to pilot their teams effectively. So a lot of it is mostly just looking objectively at what kind of pieces does the team have and what are the weaknesses, what are the strengths, and that's how we really decided this list. And so these top 3 are going to be our really, really strong teams that don't have very many weaknesses and have a lot of really pros that are going for them. And so at number 3, we're going to have our Iced Out Iowa City, which is our Mono Ghost team, coached by Cole as Ice. And this team in general, as Ghost teams are, they're very fast. Dragapult and Spectre are just elite speed tiers, 142 and 130, I believe. And you just have those speed tiers going all the way down with the 110s, 100s, 190s, and etc. So very good speed tiers, super fast mons that you don't really have to invest a lot of speed into, and therefore can go a little bit more bulky, which is really, really nice in draft because it lets you live those hits that maybe your opponent isn't expecting and get off that counterattack, that bit of chip that might be useful for the rest of the team. You also have really good physical and special breakers. I mean, Golden Go is an elite mon, as anyone who has faced it can attest to. Cerulege is also just very strong, and with that weak armor plus decent defenses, so that it can take that weakness policy hit and maybe boost up its attacks. And then a Bitterblade signature move that just heals it up and keeps it healthy for it to keep on tanking hits and clicking Shadow Sneak as good priority. And then you also have just Basque Legion, which is a strong mon that has adaptability, which just elevates its attacks so much more, especially since the Basque Legion that was drafted here is Basque Legion Female, which has access to a special stab in the Shadow Ball, which is really nice. You also have a bit of defensive pieces that do help you kind of switch in. However, they're not the best defensive pieces, as this team is a lot more offensively oriented. So you really are going to rely heavily on like Sableye and Golden Go, which you might not be able to run as offensive because you need to run more of those bulky sets. And having to run Bramble as a little bit more of a defensive piece, which it's not really a very bulky mon, does kind of hurt a little bit, but the offense is very strong, and Bramble provides that spike stacking plus every single mon on this team is a spin blocker. So unless you have a defogger, which is very limited in a mono type format, once they get up hazards, they're pretty much there to stay. And so, and even defog, Golden Go just blocks. So once they get up hazards, they're probably just going to stay there for the game. So that's going to be very pressuring and something that you're going to have to consider a lot when you're facing this team. Additionally, it does rely on breaking hard with its slower breakers. Basque Legion and Golden Go are not the fastest mons. They're around base 80, I believe. So not the fastest, speediest mons in terms of actual breakers itself. A lot of its speedier mons are more cleaners. But if you have your cleaners cleaning for each other, eventually you'll break down the team pretty easily. And those cleaners in Dragapult, Gengar's, Spectre are some of the best, arguably best cleaners in the game. So there is also a bit of, due to that lack of breakers, bit of lacking of immediate power. Just having those 2 breakers does mean that it doesn't hit as hard initially, but it can easily break down a team as it keeps slamming with its offensive options. It also doesn't cover its type weaknesses excessively, but this is kind of mitigated in that it's only weak to 1 type in Dark. Its other weakness, Ghost, is, you can't draft another mono Ghost team. So it really only has that 1 weakness of Dark, which is a bad matchup, but it can be worked around with its Terra Captains and potentially just trying to out-offense. So overall, it only has a couple of small weaknesses, but it's overall a very, very strong team, and we're excited to see how it does this season.
All right, and coming in at the number 2 spot, the runner-up, it's going to be the East Coast Empoleons, coached by Lunar Echo, with a mono water team. And I think it's pretty fitting that for both our number 2 and our number 1 spot, we have a team with a Protean user. In this case, we have Greninja and Protean being able to change your stab type into whatever move you're clicking. This is a huge boon, huge advantage in a monotype format. And so I think it is pretty fitting that the 2 Protean users are going to be in number 2 and number 1. And we also have a really, really strong weather team. Obviously, since it's water, it's going to be rain. We have Pelipper in order to provide that rain, and a really, really solid rain-abusing offensive team. You have some outstanding Terra Captains that all benefit, including Ludicolo and Floatzel. In addition, there's also other Pokemon that will benefit from rain in Greninja, of course, Walking Wake, Manaphy. There's tons and tons of rain abusers here. It has decent enough removal in Quaquaval, which I think is actually a pretty decent spinner. But being that offensive rain team, you're not going to be super duper concerned about hazard stack if you can just end the game quickly. And the difference between this and the ice team, where it's also trying to probably end some games quickly, is that water is, of course, not weak to stealth rocks. In addition, there's also a lot of good coverage for weaknesses. Both grass and electric are accounted for here, and it has potential to set its own hazards with Gren and Quagsire, as both get spikes and T-spikes. Another very notable thing here that I think that sets this weather team apart from all the other ones is that this team functions well when rain isn't up. Like, it has a I guess if you want to call it a non-rain mode, it can definitely run that if necessary. Obviously, I think 99% of the time the team here is going to prefer having rain, but say Pelipper dies early, it's not going to be completely over right off rip. So love to see that there's a little bit of consideration into that as well. I think water type naturally is the best at having a good team without the weather. So lots and lots of great offense, including breaking with Gren. Walking Wake can be offensive, and again, those rain sweepers definitely can run away with the game. And Quaquaval with Aqua Step can set up and Swords Dance and close combat the entire opposition. So there's a lot of really, really good offensive and fast, might I add, offensive options here for this team. Definitely going to be a very scary one to get matched up against. But with that, we will talk about our number 1 team.
Yes, our number 1 team is going to be the Double Iron Bashers, which is the Mono Dark team, coached by Shattered Backboards. And just looking at this team, you can see how recent all these Pokemon are. They're all like the last couple of gens. And that's because there's been an influx of very, very strong dark types that Pokemon has been really pushing these recent gens. And this team is just filled with threats, right? We have very, very strong offensive options like Kingambit, Meowscarada, Samurott setting up those automatic spikes with its really strong Ceaseless Edge option, as well as, Iron Jugulis just hitting strong Hurricanes and Dark Pulses and really putting in pressure on that special side. There also aren't really any outstanding weaknesses overall. The team kind of covers all of the bases that you're really looking for, and hazard control plus offensive options plus just having strong mons in general. and being more versatile depending on the matchup. Speaking of matchups, it does cover its type matchups very well. It's weak to fairy and fighting, and it has options for both of those types. It has Overquill and King Gambit for fairies, and it also has Mandibuzz, Jugu, and in general Terra Captain Umbreon as well for that fighting type. It also has a very bulky one in Tinglu, which really fits into its defensive backbone really well, with Tinglu, Overquill with that Intimidate ability, and Mandibuzz as a very strong defensive core that is facilitated by Umbreon being able to blanket check a lot of things with its really high defensive stats, as well as foul play preventing setup and Toxic wearing down those defensive checks to the overwhelming offense that this team offers. You also have overwhelming offense on this team that is only supplemented by the insane coverage that Meow has. Meow pretty much has some kind of coverage move for every team and every type, which really makes it a very versatile mon that, with that protein ability that Central was talking about, makes it really strong in this format, allowing it to both defensively automatically turn out of its type, functioning as a third Terra Captain, but also just having very strong stab attacks in other types that help it break down any of those types that are really threatening to it. It also does have some interesting low tier options in Murkrow and Mastiff, which have some utility with that Prankster, as well as just that interior shenanigans that Mastiff can really put in. The only real weakness that we saw on this team is that it lacks a bit in special offense, and that Iron Jugu is its really only special option. But the rest of the team is so strong, and in general it has such good options that we really felt that it deserved that #1 spot. Especially since it also has some premier hazard removal in Mandibuzz and Morpeko, which is definitely a very high premium and a really high standard that Monotype provides, since that the limited number of spinners and good defoggers as well. So yeah, overall this is why we ranked this team at #1, and yeah, we're excited to see what all these teams do this season.
Yeah, for sure, it's gonna be a very fun season. Week 1 is right around the corner. Some games are going to be rolling out here quickly, and so we'll see sooner or later these teams be put into action. And I don't know about you, but I cannot wait to see how wrong these power rankings are. So yeah, these things are going to age poorly, I'm sure, but we thought that we'd run through them for fun. And yeah, that's going to be it from us. Thank you again for coming out as Smaster.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And that's going to be it for this video. If you made it to the end, then I hope you enjoyed. Don't forget to continue to monitor the channel, as there will be some GLCC uploads coming out very shortly. And until the next one, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Goodbye. Go Seattle Slashers, and I guess go Miami Heatrans since you're here. I usually say go Seattle Slashers at the end of the video. So go Slashers, go Heatrans, and we'll see you in the next one.